All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started now. So people, if you just grab what you want and be seated. So it's a great honor for me to to moderate this panel. I, as most of you know, am Brian Wildenthal. I'm on the faculty at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, which is kind of across the valley and over the hill. We're now downtown in the East Village area of downtown, and delighted if anyone wants to come by and check out our facility. I'd be glad to show anyone around, either on this visit or on some later visit. So I teach constitutional law there at Thomas Jefferson and American Indian law. So it's a great honor to have Professor Ian Bartrum, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, here to present his paper, Two Dogmas of Originalism, and a particular honor to have Professor Larry Solom, of course, whom you all know from Georgetown, who has written much more in the field than I've been able to read so far, and I constantly have stacks of books and articles, and his work is always, I'm reminding myself, is top priority to read more about originalist theory. So without further ado, we'll be following again 10 minutes for Ian to present his paper, 10 minutes for Larry to reply, and I will be on the lookout, of course, for people who want to get in the queue. I've not been following whether people have been kind of raising their hands even during the initial main talk. I guess that's fine. So just do kind of raise your hand sort of prominently and make sure I make eye contact with you, and I'll signal or something, so then you'll know that I have you down in the list. So without further ado, Ian.
Well, thank you. I want to echo everyone's thanks to the Originalism Center and everyone, Michael Rappaport, for organizing and hosting this, and for selecting my odd little black sheep of a paper to be included in the presentation. And second, I want to thank Larry for agreeing to comment on it. I was saying that I've presented this a couple times, and opponents have said, I wish Larry Solom was here to rip you apart. And so I said, if you want to come on down to San Diego, you can see the carnage.
Careful what you wish for.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So, but in reality, Larry's been very generous to me and my work since I first met him at the 2010 ALS Conference on the Interpretation Construction Distinction, so I'm grateful for his comments. And I'm also more than honored to be included with this sort of illustrious, prestigious group. It's more than a little bit intimidating, so thanks for doing that to me. So this paper grew out of some thoughts that ran around my head as I sat at the New Originalism Conference that Saul Cornell hosted up at Fordham a little while back, and some of you were there as well. I happened to bump into an irascible law school classmate, friend of mine there in the bathroom, and he said in characteristic style, are you still writing that Phil Bobbitt derivative crap? You know, you need to drop that. I mean, after all, Bobbitt has. And I said, yeah, too true, you might be thinking. But the problem is that I can't, because I actually think Bobbitt's right. Maybe me and Dennis Patterson are the two, right? Not right in all the particulars, maybe, but right in his fundamental insight, which I think he summed up pretty well in one sentence when he said, law is something that we do, not something we have as a result of what we do. That is to say, as I think is pretty commonplace, law is a practice and not an artifact. And that insight applies, I think, paradigmatically to the practice of constitutional law. So what does that insight mean, really? I've already owned up to being a little bit odd, so I'm going to get a little odder and draw an eclectic analogy to a different practice, the study of Zen Buddhism. Eugen Herrgel, you may know, was a German philosopher who wanted to learn about Zen, and so he took a position at the University of Tokyo, and he tried to learn about Zen first by reading the expositions of famous Zen Buddhists, but he pretty quickly understood or learned that he wasn't going to understand the true essence of Zen just by reading about it. And so I'll quote, despite all the efforts of Zen experts, the insight afforded to us Europeans into the essence of Zen has remained exceedingly scanty. As though it resisted deeper penetration, after a few steps, one's groping intuitions come up against insurmountable barriers. Wrapped in impenetrable darkness, Zen must seem the strangest riddle which the spiritual life of the East has ever devised. Much of the reason for this painful feeling is that Zen is akin to pure introspective mysticism. Unless we enter into the practice of Zen by direct participation, we remain outside, turn and twist as we may. In other words, Zen is a practice and not a theology. We cannot hope to fully understand it by reading a text. We must access it through some kind of action. Herrgel decided he would focus his practice on archery, and the resulting book is pretty good. Okay, so my contention, really, Bobbitt's contention, is that constitutional law, like Zen, is only meaningful and ultimately only comprehensible as a practice. That is, by doing it, not by theorizing about it. It's, of course, quite unlike archery, but it's very like another social practice, language, or at least language in the way that Wittgenstein described it later in his life. Language, like law, is a practice that grows up out of particular social contexts and social problems, what Wittgenstein called forms of life, and it is intimately and unavoidably, ineluctably bound up with the forms of life within which it arose. Within a particular form of life, language or utterances derive their meaning from informal social rules, which we learn to follow, eventually reflexively, as we go along. The process is something like learning a card game by playing a few hands of it. Indeed, Wittgenstein, as you probably know, called these forms of life and their associated rules language games. And I'm almost finished talking about Wittgenstein, I promise, but a couple more, I think, important points. First, to carry on the card game analogy a little bit further, the individual cards have meaning only in reference to the rules of a particular game. It is idle, for example, to speculate about the true meaning of the 10 of spades, right? That card only has a meaning relative to how it may be used within a given game. In fact, Wittgenstein famously thought that the idle speculation on questions about the true meaning of words, justice, the good, was the source of many, if not all, philosophical problems. Second, unlike a card game, this is just to sort of end the card game analogy, the rules governing language games are always changing and evolving, and the only way we can keep up is to keep playing along. This change in rules is inevitable because our forms of life are always changing and evolving, and as I said before, language is ineluctably tied to the form of life of which it is a part. That is, language does not exist apart from our lived practices. It is not an artifact that we can pick up, examine separately, transport around through time and space. What works in one way cannot work precisely the same way in another language game. A word that makes up part of a particular form of life cannot, in other words, have the same meaning once that form of life has ceased to exist. Now, this does not mean that some features of the cards are not shared across many games. The numbers still indicate higher and lower numbers, though the relative meaning of high and low may change. But the crucial point is that when the form of life that gave rise to, say, the words commerce among the several states inevitably withers away, so does the semantic meaning that we might have fixed to that phrase. Without the ability to practice the form of life, and I say to practice the form of life that gave it the meaning, the commerce card is just like any other in the deck, a symbol awaiting a use or a construction. Or to put it yet another way, whatever it was that commerce referred to in 1787 simply no longer exists. The best we could hope to do is to draw some kind of analogy between what existed in 1787 and something that exists in our own form of life. But analogizing is, of course, an act of construction, not of interpretation within the meaning of New Originalism. So hopefully I've illustrated for you, without rehashing verbatim the paper, which everyone theoretically read, why we can't fix historical semantic meanings and transport them through time to our own lives. All we can do is play the cards that we hold within our own form of life and according to the rules of our own language game or constitutional law game. In some cases, not much has changed, right? The age of 35 years still plays pretty much the same. But in other cases, much is different. But like it or not, semantic meaning is unavoidably an entailment of our current lives and the rules of our current games. I hope I've made the case in the paper that the rules of our modern constitutional practice don't require, in any exclusive way, that we refer to fixed historical usages in interpreting constitutional language. History is certainly a part of the rules, and it's a part of the way we derive semantic meaning in our modern games, but it is not, and nor has it ever been, I think, the exclusive source of semantic meaning. Not to say that it couldn't be someday, but that it isn't now. So, time waning, I'll move on just briefly to the second part of the paper, which is the second dogma, the constraint principle, which holds that constitutional doctrine must be consistent with original semantic meaning absent very weighty reasons. First of all, this is a normative claim, unlike the descriptive claims that I think have to go into making up semantic meaning. And as a normative claim, it requires some justification. And so borrowing from Mitch Berman and Kevin Toe, I have suggested two broad schools of thought about these justifications. First, we might justify constraint as a theory of law. That is the original public meaning of the constitutional text, not the text, but the original public meaning is exclusively, or even highly inclusively, let's say, the law. And we're bound by that for the same reason we're bound by any law. I say in the paper that I hadn't seen any persuasive efforts to support that view. Maybe I'll have to change my mind after today and reading Will's paper, but I'm dubious about that. The other possibility is to justify the constraint principle as a particularly efficacious theory of adjudication, that is, that it produces good results if we judge this way. And that's the claim I take the new originalists to be making. I could be wrong, and I'm open to correction. But I point out in the paper that there's something question-begging about this justification. After all, what counts as a good result is exactly the contest in constitutional explication. But leaving that aside for the moment, I actually make sort of the Burkean claim that any strong theoretical constraint on our lived experience, traditions, interpretive practices is inherently dangerous for the same reasons that Burke and the English conservatives reacted against the French Revolution, etc. And I won't go on with any more of those quotes as a matter of time, but just say thank you.